Hello there, you're watching All 24 News special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file. I am your host, Karim Zachary. Russia steps up its shelling in Ukraine's Kharkiv and Donetsk region after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky wants to expect intensified hostilities ahead of an expected European Union decision on Kiev's bid for candidate status. Zelensky took the war in his country from a different angle, as it spurred global food shortages and famine fears across the African continent. A month into the most severe and coordinated sanctions by Western government, Russia's economy is showing signs of cracking, with the ruble swinging in value against the dollar and many educated Russians reportedly fleeing the nation. Russia's economy is facing a contraction unlike any it has ever seen before. And to delve more into the topic, I am joined live via Skype by Christopher Isagiu, writer, foreign affairs analyst, along with Dario Salinas Palacios, geopolitical consultant, CEO, Cassini from Spain. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. We commence right after this break. So here's what's on tap today, the updates before we delve into discussion. Addressing the African Union, President Zelensky of Ukraine on Monday called Africa a hostage of the ongoing conflict in his country. The blockade of Ukraine's grain exports have sparked grain and fertilizer shortages and put millions of people at risk of hunger. Volodymyr Zelensky said his government was engaged in complex negotiations to unblock grain reserves trapped in Ukraine's Black Sea ports.
Africa is in fact a hostage. It is a hostage of those who unleashed war against our state. Yes, this is a war. Russia's war against Ukraine. It's neither a crisis nor a conflict, as it is sometimes defined. No, this is a war. A brutal war and aggression.
So let me start with you, Mr. Christopher Isagiu. Ukraine plays a crucial role in the global food supply, as does Russia with fertilizers. How likely is this conflict going to affect the world, Europe, the US, and Africa in particular, according to you?
I think definitely it's going to affect it, and it is already affected quite greatly. We know with fall coming up, with the fall harvest in the southern hemisphere and actually the northern hemisphere as well, we already know that food prices are soaring. There's inflation here in the United States. I think the African nations are incredibly the most vulnerable because they rely on a lot of their food supply, their grain, corn, and sunflower oil from Ukraine and also Russia. So essentially, it's already affecting it, and it will continue to affect it as long as the conflict goes on, and also really as long as Vladimir Putin chooses to weaponize the grain supply, and essentially as part of the Russian strategy of hybrid warfare, continues to essentially plunder, illegally seized Ukrainian grain from Ukrainian lands that he is essentially holding hostage. So I very much echo President Zelensky's sentiment that it's definitely a part of Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation strategy to make sure that the world is held hostage by the war in terms of increasing food prices and other commodities.
If this is a pressure card that can be played by Russia, don't you think that it could be used by Ukraine as well, perhaps to put pressure on Western nations to supply them with heavy weapons?
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. And I think that you see with this latest comment of President Zelensky to the African Union, I think you see that, a little bit of that, in a sense that, President Zelensky is in a very difficult situation. His country's at war. He really needs to rely on the heavy weaponry from the West. And, Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe and indeed the world. And so definitely President Zelensky is going to try and use this to his advantage. And in a sense, he has to, and naturally he will, because his Russia seized about 25% of the land. A lot of the land that Russia has seized, and very purposefully seized, is grain-producing land and other very important agricultural land in Donbass. And so, therefore, Russia is essentially collecting the grain, plundering the grain, blocking the Black Sea Fleet access. And so Zelensky actually is smart to leverage that to his advantage and call for expedition expediting the arms supplies to Ukraine and other economic concessions. And actually, he's getting a lot from the European Union as well, in terms of new loans and new guarantees, as well as the possibility of Ukraine's accession to the succession, I should say, to the European Union. Mm-hmm. So definitely President Zelensky is right to do that.
All right. Let's include in the conversation Mr. Dario Salinas Palacios. Zelensky says that it's true that the war in his country may seem very distant to the African countries. However, its consequences are affecting the homes of millions of African families. What's your say in this, Professor? And how is the war affecting these regions? I mean, we see that Africa has a lot of potentials. Let's take, for example, Sudan as an example, which was nicknamed not long time ago as the food basket of Africa. If invested well, I mean, it could feed not only Africa, but even Europe and even other continents. Why do we see the focus mainly here on Ukraine or Russia? Why aren't the West looking for alternatives and keeping Ukraine and Russia play this pressure card?
Yes, of course, I agree with my colleague Christopher. The consequences of this war are global, including Africa. This situation demonstrates the impact of geopolitics and its articulation between the local and the international level. We have already seen how it affects supply and price in the energy, food sector, among other sectors. It's going to cause a direct shortage in many countries that they are already suffering the climatic consequence and from also wars today. This is the case of Egypt, Sudan, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. In many of these countries, more than 90% of the food is imported. So this is going to be a challenge.
Mm-hmm. How, as a European, how do you feel the consequences of these global, let's say, food crises there? Because we have many reports saying that a lot of commodities have been, skyrocketing when it comes to prices.
Yes, this also opened the debates of the democratic model and the consequence in internal democratic states. Obviously, the increase of the food and the materials is going to be different according to the different regions in the world. We have also to understand that we also came from an economic crisis, more recently from a pandemic. So our economies, they are very fragile. Maybe it can change trade policies. For example, we are seeing that some producing countries are protecting themselves to have food security. It's the case of India, which has already announced that will not export wheat or other cereals. India is the second largest producer in the world. It came from suffering a drought in a part of his territory. But in other cases, other productive areas, like in Europe, we also expect to be valued the increase of the land crops to start to produce wheat.
Mm-hmm. Understood. On Western sanctions now, Mr. Christopher Insagio, the World Economic Forum having declined to invite President Putin and other sanctioned entities to its meetings at Davos, Russia convened its own version of Davos in St. Petersburg last week. The Russian Davos the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum was no crisis improvisation. It's been running for 25 years, but it's clearly long been a kind of junior achievement, World Economic Forum. President Putin delivered the keynote address. His theme was the present difficult time comes from the doomed American attempt to maintain an unipolar world under its own direction after declaring victory in the Cold War. Does this mean that the sanctions and the efforts made by the EU and Western allies are failing here?
No, I don't think so. Actually, I think if anything, if there's a consistency with Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation under his his regime or his rule, is that when Vladimir Putin complains about something, it's usually because it's hurting him. So really, it's not about. If you look at even his official government proclamations, how he appears and talks on the news. I think recently he commented that the Western sanctions are a form of barbarism against Russia, which means that obviously he's feeling it, even though he tries to cast this sort of casual, je ne sais quoi, or I don't care type of an attitude. However, I think that Russia is under extreme pressure from the sanctions. I think that especially being cut off from SWIFT and the sanctions on Russian gas and oil, essentially, nobody's buying it, only Germany and a few other countries, and then the West is essentially weaning itself from the addiction to Russian gas and oil. So I think very much he's feeling it. I think the St. Petersburg Economic Forum has been a little bit of a an attempt at a Davos, but it's never been really that successful in terms of Russia's only ever produced a few things, and most of those have been commodities, oil and gas and weaponry. Really, Russia doesn't really export very much else other than grain to Africa, which is of course important. But in terms of actual services or goods or technology that the rest of the world, especially the developed world or even the Western world, if you will, wants, Russia doesn't really have much to offer. So, I think these are all factors. I think also there's something to be questioned about assuming that the United States has been the one that has been pursuing this sort of unipolar world, when really it's actually Vladimir Putin's actions that have really caused a lot of his problems, rather than blaming it on the United States, which of course obviously has its own self-interests. Really, you have to just look at the actions of Vladimir Putin, really in his entire tenure as a president. There's an idea in Russian foreign policy, it's called mnogopolarnost, which essentially means multipolarity. And it was a reaction to, essentially the fall of the Soviet Union. And part of the Russian doctrine, and Putin has very much enhanced and developed this policy, is that the idea of the world should be multipolar, that it should not be unipolar in terms of relying only on the West or the United States. There should be different capitals of power, if you will. And, Beijing, China would be another one. Putin has always wanted to think, and he fancies that Moscow is a great center of power in the multipolar world. But, factually, it's not, and it's always been a fading power for a variety of reasons. And I think this latest act of warfare against Ukraine reflects Russia's desperation, really using the last tool of state, which is the use of force. As von Clausewitz said, war is just politics by another means. So I think you see really in Russia's kind of against the ropes. So I think those are all factors to be considered when asking that question.
But how do you explain the repercussions of the sanctions on the West themselves? I mean, the U.S. at top, and the citizens complaining about the substantial amount of aid and money sent to Ukraine while they are desperately needed at home.
Well, I think there's two different things there. I think the sanctions are one thing. I think the foreign aid provided to Ukraine as part of U.S. foreign policy is another thing. So those are two different things that shouldn't be confused. Sanctions in terms of the United States are not really affecting us, other than inflation, which is of course important, and the rise in oil prices and gas prices. Those things are rising because of the war, which again was Vladimir Putin's fault. Ukraine didn't start the war. Vladimir Putin did on February the 24th. And actually, Ukraine was making numerous overtures for peace. And Vladimir Putin was the one who was dishonest and never wanted peace. He was planning an invasion. So I think that rise of inflation and rise of gas is definitely part of it. But foreign aid to the United States, that's really for the American people to decide. I'm sorry, foreign aid to Ukraine from the United States. That's for the American people to decide. And currently, an overwhelming majority of Americans are backing the United States helping Ukraine. Of course, there is a concern that resources can be spent back within the United States, but the United States is a very wealthy country, and helps the entire world really. So to say that the current small amount of aid that the United States is providing Ukraine is somehow causing further economic problems at home, I think is a canard. It's false.
Point clear. Mr. Dario Salinas Palacios, Putin said that the West expected to suddenly and violently crush the Russian economy to hit Russia's industry, finance, and people's living standards by destroying business chains, forcibly recalling Western companies from the Russian market, and freezing Russian assets. He denies that the sanctions made any negative change or impact in Russian economy, although Russian citizens are showing the contrary. What's your take on this? Too often, the economic, humanitarian, and foreign policy costs of U.S. and Western sanctions far outweigh any benefits. What then could and should be done?
Yes, at the moment, trade sanctions against Russia don't seem for European Union to have the expected effects. Russia had been preparing for this conflict by diversifying its trade relations. At the moment, Russia has a surplus of $200 million thanks to the export of gas, oil, and raw materials. The question maybe should be made to the European Union and the governments how high it wants the bill next winter. We will see how it affects the domestic economy and its transfer to public opinion. It would be necessary to raise and make public opinion understand that Europe is really at war and it has consequence in their internal societies.
Very nice indeed. Let me move on here with some info. The Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov's auction of the Nobel Peace Prize sold for $103.5 million on Monday night, surpassing the previous record for a Nobel. Muratov has said the proceeds will go directly to UNICEF in its efforts to help children displaced by the war in Ukraine.
Tonight, that amount is 100 million Swiss francs, which was the choice in currency. And it was a heritage bid increment approximation. So it's 100 million Swiss francs that has been contributed to UNICEF of Switzerland and Liechtenstein, to that organization, and will flow through to the international UNICEF organization and be distributed to aid in the refugee crisis in Ukraine and neighboring countries, and at that amount likely around the world, right? That is a tremendous sum of money, and it really opens up the doors for a more profound way to sort of address refugee crises and displaced peoples everywhere. That is a record for heritage auctions. It's a record for a Nobel Prize. It is a landmark achievement. It is certainly among the most significant donations to UNICEF that has ever been recorded as well, but I leave them to talk about that.
So let me get back to you, Mr. Christopher Issajew. International generous funding donations from the world are flocking to Ukraine. Is humanitarian funding an appropriate aid instrument in high-income countries that are receiving additional budget support? Could it divert resources from poor countries in crisis?
I don't think so. I mean, again, it depends on what country. I think, the West, Europe, Western Europe, the countries of the European Union, for the most part, the United States, Canada, Australia, these are all very wealthy countries that, while they have suffered some economic difficulties because of the war, again, a war of Putin's making. Let's not forget that, because I think it's important to emphasize that this war started with one person and this war can stop with one person, despite the attempts at obfuscation by Mr. Putin. But I think that really the wealthy countries are, the amount of aid that they're giving Ukraine is really a drop in the bucket compared to as a percentage of gross domestic products. For example, if you take Germany, which has been very reticent and slow to provide Ukraine with the heavy weaponry that it's actually already committed. The German economy has benefited from Russian gas and oil tremendously. They take in and spend billions of dollars on Russian gas, and if you take that and put it juxtapose it to the amount of aid that they've given Ukraine, even militarily, it doesn't even compare. So the amount of aid that Ukraine is getting, while it's substantial and while Ukrainians and President Zelensky are very grateful, I think is really still a drop in the bucket in terms of, a lot of the wealthy nations give aid all over the world, and so it's not necessarily taking away from anything else.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Dario Salinas Palacios, to what extent is the international humanitarian effort using and strengthening national systems and local aid groups?
Yes, in the case of European countries, we have realized big difference between the crisis of Syrian refugees in 2015. It's true that the events have fostered international solidarity. In southern countries like Spain, Italy, or Greece, it exists before networks about NGOs and local governments, and they are respond to this challenge very well. The question will be in the following months if the economy continue with the increase of prices and the public opinion start to change about the regard of the economy, how public opinion is gonna revalue these questions.
Mm-hmm. An estimated 60,000 demonstrators gathered in front of the Georgian parliament, waving European and Georgian flags, days after the European Commission suggested waiting before granting Tbilisi candidate status. Several pro-European organizations and all the opposition groups had called for a march for Europe on Monday evening in Tbilisi. The rally goal is to send a signal to Brussels, as EU leaders are due to discuss this week whether to grant official candidate status to Georgia, as well as Ukraine and Moldova.
This gathering is an illustration of our unity and strength. We want to show our common conviction and say today that we are part of the European family.
Mr. Christopher, Europe's unity over the war in Ukraine is at risk as public attention increasingly shifts from the battlefield to cost of living concerns. A survey in 9 EU member states found that despite strong support across Europe for Ukraine's bid to join the EU and the West's policy of cutting ties with Moscow, many voters in Europe want the war to end as soon as possible, even if that means Ukraine losing more territory. What's your analysis on this?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I think there's a few things going on. I think that, yes, definitely, there's this kind of pejorative term, Ukraine fatigue. And it's something that, we heard back in 2004 during the Orange Revolution, which of course was kind of a catalyst where the Ukrainian people themselves chose to a more, mostly for economic reasons, a more Western European integration approach. So definitely, if you kind of take public opinion of many Europeans, and prices are increasing. It's summer, people travel more, energy prices have increased, travel prices. I think definitely there's a natural shifting of public opinion, and no one wants a war to continue. Everyone wants a war to end, with the exception, it seems, of again Mr. Vladimir Putin, again who started the war and can finish it himself. So basically. definitely it's a factor. However, I think if you look at the European Union itself, European Union just gave Ukraine a loan of $9 billion. There's definite talk of accession to the European Union for Ukraine. So I think that definitely there's a path. I think Ukraine and Georgia have still a long way to go. I think there's a lot of reality checks that have to happen before Ukraine and Georgia can become fully fledged European Union members, as well as pushback from other member states that may not be as enthusiastic for, very good and their own economic reasons for Ukraine and Georgia joining. But I think definitely there's a path, and at the very least symbolically, it's very important to Ukraine because it shows the unification of Europe, at least politically and ideologically, behind a rules-based world, which is essentially what Vladimir Putin does not believe in. I think President Putin has often wanted to be a part of the club of the European Union, and yet he's always chosen his own path, even as per his own doctrine and foreign policy proclamations. He's always seen Russia as the third way. So Russia's always had its own path under his own sort of policy. So I think that there's a lot of factors and dynamics going on now when you consider the European Union succession question for Ukrainian countries like Georgia. On the other hand, it is fair enough for current populations of European Union members to, see if, for example, let's say Greece or other economies, Portugal, that aren't doing as well as, say, Germany or France. It's natural for them to be a little bit concerned if the European Union is considering, letting in new member states that obviously are in very bad economic shape, Ukraine especially because of the war. However, that's not to say that there still isn't a long way to go before the reality of Ukraine joining the European Union is realized.
Mm-hmm. And how do you explain the statements, or how do you analyze the statements of Vladimir Putin when he said that Ukraine is free to join the EU bloc if it wants, but it will be a semi-colony here?
Do you mean in terms of Vladimir Putin is saying it will be a semi-colony of the European Union?
Yes, during the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, he made this statement. He said that Ukraine is free to join, but at the cost of it being a semi-colony. What do you think he means here?
Well, I think that's very much in line with Vladimir Putin's rhetoric. I think the first thing that he means is he wants it to be a colony of Russia. If you see, again, looking at his entire 22 plus years in power, he's said Ukraine is not really a country. He wrote the 4,000-word his kind of manifesto, Mein Kampf type thing back last July, saying how Russia and Ukraine are intertwined, and Ukraine must be essentially subservient to Russia. So I think it's really just rhetoric. He's trying to say that if Ukraine thinks it's better off with the European Union, then it's mistaken, because essentially it'll just be an economic colony of the European Union, which I think really reflects an old Soviet cynicism and also just his own propaganda and rhetoric. I think that one thing he constantly does, and I think even in the West and even in European capitals, a lot of people tend to ignore the free agency of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, and so there's a lot of question about what does Vladimir Putin think, what does the West think, but there's not a lot of focus on what the Ukrainian people think. And it's important to note that Ukrainian people themselves have chosen the path of European Union integration, going as far back as 2004. So I think those are some of the things that I would
understood. Thank you so much. Mr. Dario, how did the Russian war against Ukraine play a major role to push European countries to their limits? We see a lot of residents complaining about skyrocketing prices on the one hand, and some of them are not really backing the fact that Ukraine could join the EU bloc, constituting a hurdle. Seeing the nature of the EU bloc, which is an economic one, we see that there is devastation and a lot of rebuilding for Ukraine to be done in order to contribute positively to the EU bloc. What's your analysis?
Well, it's happened before in 2015 during the annexion of Crimea or the Donbass war. Russian government or Putin was trying to expand their nationalisms against Ukraine. This question, in the case of European Union, opened the debates again of a democratic society against other authoritarian models. How the media or economical lobbies affect public opinion and governments facing these external threats. It's clear that it's very complex to have an agreement with 27 countries that they try to respond of their internal interests. So this is the challenge for the European Union, how to become a geopolitical unit and to have equal response against external threats that the military impact of Russia in Ukraine.
Mr. Dario, still, President Joe Biden has made it clear that any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine would be completely unacceptable and entail severe consequences. How possible do you think this war is going to turn into a nuclear one? And do you think that the West will be able to react if ever Putin decides to start a nuclear war?
Well, it's the good question. I would like to point out that the most important to avoid the nuclear war is the role and type of participation of NATO countries in the conflict. Must be carefully measured. Russia cannot perceive NATO as a direct threat in this conflict. This is really important. And we need to understand that the different geopolitical representation of each player in the conflict and how to handle the balance of them to avoid a bigger conflict.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dario. Well, we have reached the end of our special coverage. Thank you, dear guests, for your thorough analysis, and thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. Bye for now.